Hello! So, in today's lesson, we want to conclude our case study on Jack the Ripper. And we're going to be investigating what problems did the police face in trying to catch Jack the Ripper. Our lesson objectives are going to be to understand how the police tried to catch Jack the Ripper and problems they faced along the way. And we're going to try to understand the consequences of the Ripper murders. How did things change as a result? Now, before we go any further, you should have your worksheet in Google Classrooms to fill in as we're going along. I will prompt you for that. The work is due in Sunday, the 24th of May at 5 p.m. And as always, any questions or feedback you've got, my email is there, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. So, first of all, let's talk about what the police did in their investigation. How did they try to catch Jack the Ripper? And a common theme is going to be the fact that it's very different to what you might be accustomed to today with the police doing on a similar crime scene. Because they don't have the technology, and they don't have the science back then. So a lot of these methods used might seem a bit outdated or a bit strange as a result. But we'll go through these one at a time. So they used evidence from post-mortems first of all. That's where the dead body was examined. And because of the fact various parts of the body had been taken and removed, there was a suggestion that the killer had knowledge of the human body. And so that meant slaughterhouses for animals and hospitals were checked. There were follow-up from indirect leads in the newspapers. So, for example, the Manchester Guardian suggested that a person called Leather Apron was to blame. And the police followed up on these newspaper leads, and we'll come to this later on. They visited lunatic asylums where basically insane people were locked away to see if anyone had been released or if anyone had been brought in recently. Obviously, this is because of the severe nature of the killings, the fact that the person was cut open and ripped open. They set up soup kitchens, and we'll look into this in a bit more detail later on. But the idea was that if you had information you could give the police, they would give you soup instead. Why not give them a cash reward? That's what people want, isn't it? Well, if you imagine how many people would pretend that they had seen something just to get that money so they could spend it on alcohol, the police would have a lot of false information. Whereas if it's just a soup kitchen, people might feel that they are more prepared to give information away and be honest about it. It's not the same incentive as money. House searches, looking for clues relating to Jack the Ripper, maybe a knife. Of course, we looked at the housing before in Whitechapel, and you saw how people were packed together. That meant the police had to check over 2,000 lodging houses. You can imagine how long that would have taken to get all of these people out of the lodging houses, which could hold sometimes up to 400 people in each lodging house. So you had to get all of these people out and then question them and search the house itself. It would have been a nightmare for the police who tried to organise this. And people wouldn't have cooperated really at all. The police were not popular in Whitechapel as it was. Leaflets. We're starting to see as we go along here that the police are getting more and more desperate now. Leaflets. So the idea is that 80,000 of these, sometimes called handbills as well, were printed out. Here's an example of one. Just saying, look, do you know anything? Contact the police. Bloodhounds being trialled. So the police were starting to look at the idea of using animals in investigations. And they had borrowed two dogs from a member of the public, two bloodhounds called Barnaby and Burgo. And they'd started to do tests on them, getting them to trace blood, for example, see if they could detect someone traced on blood. This is actually a really good idea. But the police make the mistake of not paying the dog owner any money at all. And when the dog owner found out, he said, well, I'll take my dogs back then. And so this idea, which might have worked, possibly, never really gets off the ground at all. The police do not pay the dog owner, so he just takes the dogs away. And possibly my favourite of all, this goes to show how desperate the police got. Some of them dressed up as women. The idea was that Jack the Ripper would come up and try and kill them, and then they could sort of rugby tackle them down to the ground, pin them down below. So I don't know. I don't know what they would have done to get attention. But this doesn't work for a number of reasons. One of them being the idea that actually the policemen refused to shave their moustaches off. So just on street corners, pretending to be prostitutes, dressed in women's clothing with a moustache on, which is absolutely incredible, really. Of course, that wouldn't work. The police also some of them came up with the idea of actually, we want to catch Jack the Ripper in the act. And so they had started to put rubber on their police boots so they could creep around. It wasn't making as much noise. They could catch Jack the Ripper in the act. And I suppose this is where we see our first Nike Air Force trainers really come in effect. But all of these methods didn't work because the police had to face a number of problems trying to catch Jack the Ripper. You should have this worksheet in front of you then. We're going to fill this in as we go along. So let's look at our first of the 6 problems, which is false information. Now, the police force, like I said, were not popular at all. And over 300 letters were given in from people pretending to be Jack the Ripper. Obviously, people bored at home, didn't have anything better to do. I know what I'll do. I'm going to write a letter pretending I'm Jack the Ripper, taunting the police, and I'm going to send it to the police force. And this shows the public wasting valuable police time because the police don't know if something is genuine evidence or if it's false evidence. So the police have to follow up every letter that's handed in. A lot of police time was wasted this way. Now, if you watch the documentary, you'll remember this letter in the picture. The most famous letter is the Dear Boss letter, which is signed Jack the Ripper at the bottom. Now, it's thought today that this came from a member of the press, who basically assumed that if we call this Jack the Ripper at the end, this letter will get published, and then we can use the name Jack the Ripper in the newspapers, rather than saying, I don't know, unnamed killer or mental man, for example. We've actually got a catchy name there, Jack the Ripper, we can use. And that's where it's come from. That's why we still call the killer Jack the Ripper today. And another problem as well was that witnesses often gave conflicting accounts. People who said they'd seen something near the time, they'd seen one of the victims near the time they were killed, they would change their story, or they would say they'd definitely seen them at a time when we knew they were somewhere else. And this added to the false information as well. But it was very difficult for the police to get concrete, useful information. So, if we go back to that worksheet then, this is what I'd like you to do. False information. Can you explain why this was a problem for the police? And then can you just have a think about how big a problem this was? 0 to 10. 0 is, this is not a problem for the police at all. This won't hold them up in the investigation. 10 is, this is a huge problem. This will really significantly stop the police force from being able to find Jack the Ripper. Pause the video here and then we'll look at how this answer should look in a minute. Okay, so this is a model answer here. Yours might not be worded quite the same way, but I want to show the sort of length and detail we're looking for filling this grid in. So I've just put down there, the police had to follow up every piece of evidence given, even if they suspected it was a hoax. This meant a huge amount of police time was wasted. And the fact that witnesses could often not be trusted and they changed their stories or gave evidence that simply could not be true. And this also wasted valuable police time. So you get an idea, guys, the sort of length and detail we're looking for in this grid. It doesn't need to be a huge amount every time. I've left that one blank there. There's no definite answer for the number of how big a problem this was. It's really up to you about your judgment. And you might find actually you want to leave that till last because as we go along, some things might become bigger problems than others. Something you rated as, I don't know, a 10, you might later on go, actually, that problem was even bigger, so I'm going to bring this down to a 7. Okay, it's your own opinion for that, how big a problem was this column. So after I've gone through each problem, pause the video, and then we can move on. So, problem 2, destroying vital evidence. So a short time after the victim number 4, Catherine Eddowes, was found, the police found an important clue. Now this was a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron, and it was smeared with blood, and in the alleyway behind there was a message in chalk. And that message said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." It's quite a complex, cryptic message. What we need to do is we need to go, we've got 2 negatives there, they cancel each other out. Not and nothing. So if we get rid of both of those, this message now says, the Jews are the men that will be blamed. It's an anti-Semitic message. And there was, as we've seen before, problems with anti-Semitism in Whitechapel at the time anyway. And so this message is on the wall, and they want to get a photograph of it when the light gets better. But the problem was there was due to be a market there at 6 o'clock. And so when Commissioner Warren turns up, he sees this message. He says he's worried about the implications about what this will do for the Jewish people if this message is seen. And so he says, I want it washed off now before it can be photographed. So you've got the police force destroying vital evidence. And he said he feared a backlash against the Jewish community. That might not be the only reason. But for now, just pause the video, have a go here at problem 2. Okay, problem 3, police rivalry. There might be another reason why Commissioner Warren wanted that message removed. And that's because Eddowes was killed inside the boundaries of the city of London. If we look at this map, you can see there, Eddowes is actually killed a bit further away than the others. Now, this area that she was killed in is the city of London, which has got its own separate police force. This is a police force that is independently trying to catch Jack the Ripper. It's not working with the other police force that met. So we have got in this small area 2 separate police forces, each trying to find the Jack the Ripper killer. And so they're not working together like the police force might be today, but actually they are working separately. They are in a rivalry. And so, rather than sharing information, this is possibly why Warren ordered the message to be removed. He didn't want it to be photographed. He did not want the Met police force to have an advantage. Pause the video here and have a go at that grid. Okay, problem 4, the press. Newspapers were getting involved as well, and lots of newspapers in Whitechapel, the local papers, were very anti-police because they knew that's what people wanted to read about. They knew people didn't like the police force, and so they would produce stories that were anti-police in order to sell copies. And so they were wasting police time by producing dramatic headlines which put pressure on the police to catch Jack the Ripper. And we talked about the leather apron scandal earlier. Well, let's go back and re-examine that then. Because we've got that headline there again with leather apron, capture leather apron. And what had actually happened here was with the second murder, a leather apron had been found near the scene. And so the newspaper press basically came up with this idea of this sort of boogeyman, this idea of this villain. He's called Leather Apron, and here's a leather apron at the crime scene to prove it, and he goes around killing people. So we'll put the headline, Capture Leather Apron. And the problem with this was that in the Whitechapel area, there was a poor guy who had the nickname Leather Apron. His name was John Pizer. And so the newspapers all put this headline of Capture Leather Apron, he's the killer. Poor old John Pizer, who was completely innocent, he even had a policeman as an alibi of where he was the night of the murder. He was arrested, and the police had to follow up this as a result because the public said, you've got to find Leather Apron, you've got to arrest Leather Apron as a result. Now, I'd like to say that the newspaper press don't do this today. This is a Victorian thing, but sadly, maybe that's not true. Do you remember this one, 2018, around Christmas time, when the airways couldn't fly off, I think it was Gatwick, Gatwick on newspaper there, because of drones being flown around. And the Daily Mail, very close to Christmas, headline there, December the 23rd, produced this headline. Are these the morons who ruined Christmas? With 2 people there who were found to be completely innocent. But their Christmas was ruined. Imagine that, being on the front cover of the newspapers, you were being accused of causing all of that disruption. They were innocent, no proof at all there, but the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday produced that sensationalised headline in order to sell newspaper copies, accusing innocent people of causing disruption, just like we'd seen in the Victorian times. Now, when newspapers do this, sometimes they print an apology, but actually you can see the apology is not always particularly big at all, and it won't be on the front cover usually. So, the press. The press published stories based on journalist guesswork and unreliable interviews. They were putting the police under pressure, and so the more pressure they put the police under, the more chance of them making mistakes. And the newspapers often said suspects were foreign, The newspapers felt that someone from Whitechapel, a local, couldn't possibly have done this. And so they said this is the work of a foreign person, or this is the work of a Jewish immigrant. And so that created more hatred towards the Jews in Whitechapel. The press was saying this without actually having any evidence at all. And of course, all of this wastes valuable police time. I'll pause it there so you can complete this problem 4 of the press. Problem 5, lack of forensic techniques. And if you look at these pictures, this is probably what you're used to seeing when you watch crime dramas on TV today. You get the police tape put around, you've got people wearing suits, you have got chemicals being used to track DNA and so on, and lots of photographs taken. Yeah, but this is 1880. The police have got almost no scientific methods to help them in their investigation. The science isn't that developed yet. There's no what we call forensic techniques, trying to track parts of the body using fingerprints or DNA, for example, using science. There's no CCTV to watch of the area. And that means the only hope of catching a killer was really to catch him in the act. Again, we looked at this before, some of the police force trying to put rubber on their boots. They were quieter going around. Now, how far away was this detection to be able to track criminals? Well, it's going to be another 12 years before fingerprinting can be used to track criminals. DNA evidence only begins a later part of the 20th century. At this point, detectives couldn't tell the difference between animal blood and human blood, let alone different blood groups that people had at the time. There was no database of photographs of criminals. We will come on to that later on. And photography wasn't great at all. It was only just starting to be used to make records of a crime scene. And problem 6, the Vigilance Committee. So, the more the police failed to catch Jack the Ripper, the more the public got frustrated as a result. The Vigilance Committee is an example of this. This was a group of Whitechapel traders and businessmen, and in 1888 they were so angry at the failures of the police force, and they were annoyed that the police didn't set a reward. And their argument was, if this had happened in any other part of London, the rich areas, there would have been a reward for the killer. You've not set a reward because it's just Whitechapel, it's a poor area. And so these people said, our businesses are being affected, we will put up a reward. We will offer money if you catch Jack the Ripper to the public. And the Vigilance Committee took to the streets every night. They felt they had to protect the streets and try and catch Jack the Ripper. And so they would take it in turns to march around Whitechapel, armed with whistles, armed with burning pieces of wood. And they basically were hoping to catch the killer in the act. Now, as the police force were trying to catch Jack the Ripper in the act using silence and creep up on him, this completely undermines this. The actions of the Vigilant Committee would have scared Jack the Ripper away, and so the police never really stood a chance of catching him with the Vigilance Committee around. It damaged the investigation. I'll pause it there so you can finish the last problem, and if you need to go back, it's the red slides you need. Press play to continue on to your next task. Okay, so now you've completed your grid. Now you've given each problem faced a ranking out of 10. I'd like you to explain the biggest 3 problems you think the police faced in catching Jack the Ripper. Can you try and be nice and clear in your answers? Don't just bullet point me down 3 things. Try to explain why certain problems were bigger than others. So, for example, if you think that the newspaper printing stories was the biggest problem, tell me why that was a bigger problem than a lack of science. When you've done, press play to continue. Okay, so now let's look at the consequences of the Ripper murders. What changed as a result? Well, the police realised they would need better record keeping. And so the police force used what was called the Bertillon system in 1894. This is where, when you've got a suspect, you actually take measurements of the person. You measure how tall they are, you measure, for example, their arm width, you measure what colour hair they've got, you write down the details. And you take a photograph as well. It's called a mugshot. That's when the criminal has their photograph taken and you store it. And that meant that if you were looking for a suspect in the future, you had a database that you could refer back to as a result. Now, Fingerprint records would be used later on, and that would replace some of this, for example, measuring how wide the shoulders are. But the photograph method is still used today. If you are a criminal, if you are caught, you have a mugshot, you have a photograph taken. That's from the Bertillon system, where it's your front and the two sides of your face. In 1888, you could only really communicate with your policeman by blowing on a whistle as hard as you could. But things changed, technology improved. By the end of the century, telephone boxes were starting to be used, and bicycles were being used in 1909. Police were being far more mobile now. There's more chance of being able to catch people. Britain started to realise actually we need to improve some of these areas of England, especially places like Whitechapel. Two new laws came in. The Houses of the Working Class Act 1890. This meant that these slums that we'd seen in Whitechapel, this poor house that you can see here, actually money started to be made available to knock these buildings down and create better, improved, low-cost housing for people. And if you remember, we were looking before about the fact that the sewers were overfilling on the streets of Whitechapel. Well, the Public Health Amendment Act of 1890 said actually we want councils to improve toilets in the area, we want better paving, we want rubbish collections, and we think the water should be clean. And so slowly Whitechapel starts to improve as a result. Now, it's not all good news. You still do get some copycat killer murders, although not as many. And you do get some teenagers, something that you lot probably would have done, jumping out at women, trying to scare them, pretending they're Jack the Ripper from time to time. But Whitechapel does improve as a result. And Whitechapel today, obviously, you wouldn't recognise from the Victorian era. So, your final task today. What do you think were the most important consequence of the Ripper murders from those slides, those green slides we've looked at? Which is the most important consequence? Is it the police being able to communicate with telephones or bicycles? Or is it the fact that the area became improved, the housing quality improved for lots of people? Have a little think, write me out a reason, make sure you explain it clearly for me, please, on the worksheets. Press pause here, press play when you're done to finish this lesson. And that is it for today. Thank you very much. Please make sure that worksheet is handed in Sunday, the 24th of May, 5 p.m. Please press submit, guys, to make sure we get that work. As always, any questions or feedback, gbrown@stopsyhighschool.co.uk. Thank you so much for taking part in today's lesson. That was your final lesson looking at Jack the Ripper. That's concluded that case study now. And all it remains for me to say is, again, thank you very much. Please make sure you're getting some fresh air, you're getting some exercise, and as always, you're looking after yourself. Take care.